We're beginning on Daf Mesech Bava Metzia Daf Nun Vav. We begin 8 lines down at the top of the Yomim. We're in the middle of a conversation from the previous Daf. Rav Yosef had just told us that even though Meir was makel regarding the halacha of pidyon of ma'aser shein of demai, but it was machmer regarding the achila, which is really the halacha of our Mishnah. We had 5 cases of chaimish you have to add. One of them was consuming specifically truma, and one of the cases of truma was trumas ma'aser of demai. And even though that's rabbinic halacha, he was machmer to require the pidyon of chaimish to add on a 5th, even though it's rabbinic halacha. And that's what the Gemara continues to ask now on the teaching of Rav Yosef from a Mishnah in Masechet Ma'ashir, because of throughout the entire world. So we're discussing today's daf are this halacha b'meir that we had said. These are the time of Mishnah that we strengthen the rabbinic halacha like biblical halacha. The Gemara discusses the halacha of demai, as we said, which is when you buy from Am Haaretz, you're not sure did he take off ma'aser, did he not? Rabbinically, we require you to. Besides Truma Gedalim, the differentiation between when you buy bread from a nachtem or a palter, from a baker or from the professional baker, what the halacha is. There are certain things that the Mishnah tells us there's no halacha b'nah that applies to them. Avodim, slaves, stars, documents, karka is real estate, hektish and hektish, and there's a halacha of kachim, but that you chay b'chriyusan, that then when you have a responsibility, then there is going to be ainah because there's a part that applies not just to hektish but also to individual. The Gemara has many interesting questions regarding chit mizarn b'karka ma'u. What's halacha if you had wheat? You plant it in the ground. First of all, yesh l'mayno, ein l'mayno, is do ainah or not? Because is it karka? Is it seed? How do you qualify it? It's in the ground, so maybe it's karka, and karka doesn't have ainah. More of a nishban alain or ein nishban alain. Do you swear regarding it or not? We know ein nishban al-karka is it karka or is it considered a seed? So to im maturin or ein maturin, the carbon aimer on the second day that we're going to bring hopefully soon in the Beis Hamikdash is on the second day of Pesach. So that permits any of the new grain. But now that it's in the ground, is that considered ground and therefore not permitted with the aimer, or it is? And moreover, the Gemara tells us anything that is measured, weighed, or counted, even if it's less than the kedei halacha is chayzer, you have to give it back. It's different than just the general halacha of ainah. So we continue 8 lines down at the top of the Amud that we had mentioned with this halacha of Meir, the asacham echidus devim shel teira. So the Gemara brings a question on Ravina. Most of Ravina asks on Rabbi Yosef, who had said this chiluk between and it's actually we're going to conclude the whole discussion from the previous daf in a moment. So from Mishnah Masechet is Demai. Mishnah says, someone purchases bread from Am Haaretz baker. So we know that again when you buy from Am Haaretz, you have to assume or suspect at least that he didn't separate maasers. So ma'aser min achama ala tananis. Now you're going to be taking off maasers, but what happens if you bought cold bread and warm bread, and you take from the fridge, you take the one that he just baked, So the halach is ma'aser min achama ala tananis. You can take off maaser from the hot one on the cold one, the mitzanenis alachama from the cold one on the hot one, and vafilim mitfusim harbe. Even if there's many different types of breads that you're buying from him, and they're not even similar. And you technically could say that this baker took the loaves of this type from one person and the loaves of this other type from another person. And amaratzim, the problem is some take meiser, some don't. Now the problem would be is maybe this guy didn't take meiser and this guy did take meiser. Now why is that a problem? Because if you're going to take meiser from one on a different type, you might be taking from one that's chayiv on one that's pater. And if you're going to do that, that means the Shem Meiser does not take effect, and you can be giving tevel to the kohen because it's only if it's permitting something else. But the other thing actually had Meiser taking, or you might be taking from Potter on what that's chayiv, and therefore there's no Shem Meiser on it because you took from something that's Potter already. Comes out that the one that you're remedying is not remedied, and then you're going to be eating tevel. And that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. We're not concerned by Dmai for that. And we just suspend and we say that the guy, this Am Haaretz baker, bought it from one person. That's Divrei Meir. Now the question is, if it's true what we said in the previous daf, that the Chacham made a chizuk l'devreim kishal teiram. So Bishloimi min hatzanenis alacham, I understand that Rabbi Meir said you could take off meiser from the cold bread on the warm bread. Meaning, even though the warm bread is better than the cold one, we're not concerned. Meaning, in regards to the cold and warm element, we're not concerned because you can't take from something worse on something better. No, you could. Remember, below he says, how do we know that if someone took off truma from which is bad on something that's good, that even though you're giving truma, the inferior to the kohen, truma is going to be valid truma? It says the pasuk in Midbar. It says, that they should not carry for themselves a sin, when they elevate its choicest parts from it. Meaning, make sure you give the best to the kohen. Now, if it wouldn't be holy when you give the inferior, what would be the carrying of the sin? You didn't do anything wrong because you didn't do anything. It's not even truma. Mikan, from here you see, that if you take up truma from the bad for good, it is going to be valid truma. So I'm not concerned that you're taking from the cold on the warm, because even though you're taking from the worse for the good, that's okay, that works. But my question is, Remeir said, you can even take the vasa challah, take the egg challah, take this type of challah, and the one that in the challah. You could take from one on the other. Why? Why are you not concerned if you say that this Remeir, right? You told me the previous that Remeir holds, even though this is demai, but he's machma by demai, which rabbinic halacha like bilik halacha. Hey, you might be taking from chayav apat. It might be from two different people. Why are you not concerned based on everything that we said? This is where the Gemara ends its conversation. Now the Gemara is going to make a summary of our Abaya, going back to the beginning from the Gemara in the previous Amid till we got up to over here. Interesting Gemara. Amar Abaya says like this: Rebbe Lazar shaper kokashile. Rebbe Lazar, who opened up our Gemara on the previous Daf, he had a good question on our Mishnah. His question was, one of the cases of the 5 cases of eating truma was if you eat trumas mais of demai that you have to go ahead and add on a 5th. He said, "V'chiyasu chizik." Well, the Rabban was so machmer that they made it the mamish have to add on the choimish. That was his question. Now, Ushmuel, who answered the question, and he says, yeah. You know the time of the Mishnah is? It's Remeir. And he brought a raya from Hamevi Get. That you didn't see the rabbinic requirement of Befan in Echtav. Mamze, you have to be Yaitzi. Loi Shabba Kamashanle. Says Abaya, Shmuel's answer was not sufficient, as he continues to explain. So the Gemara explains. Because the Kashalei Rebbe Lazar, what was bothering Rebbe Lazar was, did the Chachamim make a strengthening of a Truma's Meiser of Demai, which is a light Isser? Why? Because even definite Truma is only at most Misa de Bidei Shemayim. If a non-Kohen eats it, even for regular Truma, he gets death at the hands of heaven. So the whole halacha is a leichte halacha. And it's rabbinic. Truma is Meiser Shel Demai. So Rebbe Lazar was bothered. What's haste? Why we have to add on the Chaimish? Now, Mishan Le Shmuel, what did Shmuel answer? He says, yes, I'll show you that it's Remeir, because he made a strengthening for rabbinic halacha by Ashes Ish, by a married woman. Oh, that biblical Isser is Mrs. Bezdin. Come on, that's very severe, that you get capital punishment in court. Dimashani Mrs. Bezdin, the Chamiro. Come on, I mean, maybe Mrs. Bezdin is different because it's more stringent. How could you bring a raya to answer Rebbe Lazar's question regarding our Mishnah? That was that phase. Now, the next thing we have in the Gemara, which Abai continues to expound on and highlight, he says, V'Rav Sheshes had asked on Shmuel from the halacha of Chil Meiser Sheni. He said, really, Shmuel? You're telling me the time of Mishnah is Remeir, and Remeir is Machmer b'Divreim Kishaltera? But I could show you by the halacha of Chil of Demai, the Chum did not make Chizuk l'Divreim Kishaltera. Because we saw that you can mechal kesev on the chayshes, the chayshes on kesev, and that doesn't work by ma'aser vadai. So that was Rav Shesh's question. Says Abaya, loy shaper komaisavle. Rav Sheshes did not have a good question on Shmuel. Why? Because the Kamri inhu misa, Rebbe Lazar and Shmuel, they were talking about at least death penalties. Mrs. Bezdin, Mrs. Beshamayim. U'maisav Rav Sheshes, was fragt Rav Sheshes? A lav. Just a negative prohibition, because chilul, if you don't do it well, at most what you're doing is you're violating just a negative prohibition of Torah. Says the person you can't eat it in your gates. It's not a Mrs. Bezdin, not a Misa B'dei Shemayim. So was fragst du? In the Chanami, there we're not so machmer. Now, moving on, But ulumai demais Rav Sheshes says Abaya. Aber Lloyd was Rav Sheshes hadyagevreg. But what according to what he did ask, Rav Yosef Shaper Kamashanile. Rav Yosef, however, had a good answer on that question, because Rav Yosef said, "You're right, Rav Sheshes. Even though Rameh was lenient regarding the pidyon of demai, but it was machmer regarding the eating, as he brought a raya that you see that for eating purposes we're very machmer even by demai." But then Abaya ends off the last thing we just said. After Rav Yosef, we started today this amid was El Ravina. Ravina had gefregt. We ended up with a question of Ravina on Rav Yosef. And gefregt, really? We're machmer with the eating? What do you do in the Mishnah with demai? You see that we're afilim etfusim harbe. Reb Meir is not being concerned with this rabbinic halacha of demai, even regarding eating. That was his question. That's where we ended off. Says Abai, on that I have a question. Instead of him asking from the regular baker, which you're right, he seems to be asking a good question on Rabbi Yosef that we're being lenient by demai. He could support Rabbi Yosef instead of asking him from the other case of a palter. Rashi explains a palter, if you want to understand the equivalent, is regarding bread, he's like what a situn is, a wholesaler, regarding tivua, regarding grain. Meaning the palter, he's a manufacturer. Not a manufacturer, he's actually a wholesaler. He buys tons of loaves, and then he's the middleman. He sells to bakers and to stores. He's the wholesaler. The Mishnah teaching demai halakechem and a palter. If someone buys from a wholesaler of bread, ma'asrim and called defos v'tfos. Remei says, you know what? You have to take ma'aser from every type of loaf that there is. You see, Remei is concerned that you might be mafresh from the chiv on the potter. So that supports Rav Yosef, that we see we're being machmer on demai. So Elamayas l'chol member. But what are you going to say? What's the difference? Why is he concerned by palter? I'll tell you why. Because palter mitrate lasa gabri's oven. He buys from 2-3 different types of bakers. Nachtam nami. So then a regular baker also, the reason why there he's not concerned, the reason why it's not difficult is because he holds that a baker, because he doesn't buy many together, we could suspend the mechad garva who's oven. He bought it for one person. And that one person, does whole wheat and does pull aparts and does all these different types of things. And therefore, not machmer over there. So therefore, that was where Abaya ends, like with a question on Ravina's question. He says, you could support Rav Yosef, which was Abaya's Rebbe, from the case of Palta. Now, this was Abaya's summary of what we had said and his reflections on it. Now the Gemara just concludes, Rava Amar, he says, no, Shmuel Shaper Kamashanle. One of the points Rabbi had made was Shmuel didn't have a good kasha. And Rava says, name. Shmuel did Shmuel did answer well. Because Shem Misa Ba'elam. Meaning, although Abai was saying, he said, well, what's Shmuel answering? Our mission is talking about at most a Misa B'dei Shemayim. And Shmuel is bringing from Eshes Ish, which is Misa Bezdin. And Rava says, yes. Lamaisa, it's referring to death. And therefore, you could bring a raya that Remei was machmer by Misa, and therefore to say he's a Tan of the Mishnah, even for Misa B'dei Shemayim. Now going back to halacha of Ainah that we're discussing in the previous Mishnayos, says the Mishnah, Eilu Devarim she'elam Ainah. The following things, the halacha of Ainah does not apply to them. The Gemara can explain the reason why. Is havadim, is non-Jewish servants, vashtares. If someone sells documents that that person can now collect the debt inside of that document and take it for himself, when he sells the document, there's no unfair pricing related to that. Bakakais, regarding real estate, bakdeshes. So if you have the treasurer selling hektish, or a personal individual selling his oila that developed a blemish, there's no halacha v'ainah. Moreover, not only that, these items, ein lem tashlumi kefil. If any of these 4 items were stolen, the Gana pays only Karen, not kefil, and also b'loi tashluma b'vechamisha doesn't pay 4 or 5 times if the item was slaughtered or sold, which, as Rashi points out, it was really only necessary for the case of hektish to say this last one. Obviously, it doesn't apply to avodim, shtaros, and kakois, because the whole halacha of tashlum above chamisha is only by a shar and a set. So obviously it wouldn't apply to real estate and whatever and all those types of items. Moreover, another thing that applies to these 4 items, another interesting part is shemechinim in a nishba. An unpaid custodian doesn't have to swear that he was not negligent, because the Torah did not require you to swear on these 4 cases. And a paid guardian is actually not obligated to pay for these items if it was stolen from him. Now, Shimon, he makes a differentiation. He makes a distinction as a Getintam and Beis. He says, Kachim shuchai b'achriyusa. Even though we said a blanket halacha regarding Kachim, he says, but if it's a Kachim that the person is obligated to insure it, which Rashi explains, what case is that? The guy says, Hari alai oila. Hari alai is like a neder, you're taking responsibility. And then he separates it, and it develops a blemish, and then he sells it. So then, yesh lamayna. The halacha b'na would apply. The reason for that is because since if it would die or if it would get stolen, this person would have to insure it, so it's like his. And therefore the halacha of al-toina ish achav would apply to this carbon. Now, however, if he's not responsible for what happens to them, let's say he says harizu, it's like a nedava, if something happens, he doesn't have to compensate hektish, then the halacha b'na does not apply, because it's totally hektish. As we said, hektish does not have the halacha b'na. Yudam, he says actually, he says that even if someone sells a Sefer Torah or an animal or a gem, a pearl, they don't have the halacha b'na. The Gemara is going to explain the reason in the Brisa later on, after the Chesed Beis. Why would that be that these items don't have b'na? Which Amar Levi said to him, no, they only said these items that we mentioned. It's not true what you're saying. Says Imam, where do we know this halacha that a no does not apply to these items? The talking about in the Brisa. Plus says when you're going to sell a sold item to your friend, or you're going to buy it from the hand of your friend, which is miyad mesecha tells us davar nik miyad liyad. Something that's bought from hand to hand. That's where the Torah is warning you on bal toinu. Yatzer karkais, that excludes real estate, chain metalton, which are not movable items. Yatzu avodim, it also excludes slaves, because we know shehuk shel karkais, they're always compared to karka, as the pasuk of the Yikar Chavei, this nachaltim oisam, which they're compared to like an achuza, like an ancestral field that does not have this halacha sota avodim. And yatzu shtaris, it also excludes documents, because the pasuk says when you're going to sell a sold item, which is shakufay machar begufay kanei, which is the item itself is being sold and the item itself is being bought. Yotzer shtaris, that exclude documents ain't gufan machar, ain't gufan kanei. It's not the item itself. The paper is not really what's being sold and bought. It's only for the information inside of it, for the proof, for the evidence, and therefore the halacha b'no would not apply to the selling of a shtar. Which Mikan Amr, actually from here is where they said, from the fact that we're only excluding shtaris only because the actual item itself is not what's being sold or bought. But if let's say someone sells his documents to a perfumer who he wants to wrap the spices that he has, comes out that the sale of the paper here is actually for the purposes of the utility, yes, then actually the shtar would have halacha b'na, because here the item itself is being sold and bought. Says Gemara Pshita, obviously. Why would it be different than all other movable items? Says Gemara, no, there's a chiddush over here, lafukim mirav kahana. Because Amar, he says, ein no prutas, there's no halacha b'na on prutas, on something that's only less than a silver coin, it's for prutas. Kamash malan, yes or no prutas, that we're saying that even though this paper is actually, generally when you're selling these papers for the perfumer, the purchase price is not equal to that of an isur, is that of a few copper coins. Even so, the halacha b'na will apply. The next item we said in the Mishnah was hekdeshes. How do we know that there's no einah? Because Amakra, the pasuk says achiv. Leisana ish says achiv, which is achiv alay hekdesh. The halacha only applies to your brother, not to hekdesh. But maskebla Rabbi Bava Metzia asks on the Brisa. The Brisa had said, we learn out that karka is excluded because it says miyala misecha. Says Gemara Kolech, the Siv Yodeh, wherever it says his hand is Yodeh Mamashu, means literally his hand that you be medayik. Miyara Misecha has to be Dafka Metallim, which is bought from hand to hand. El Miyat have a problem. What do you do with the pasuk? The Siv, it says the pasuk in Midbar. So Yikach has called Arta Miyodeh. He took his whole land from his hand. I mean, Hachanam de Kol Arba Yodeh have in the Katli. You think he was holding his whole land in his hand? El Mishuz, it means from his possession. So Hachanam Mishuz here, it also means from his possession. And Amischa would tell us that even Karka is. So why are you saying it means dafka metalin? So the Gemara responds and says, not true. You think you think wherever it says yodeh lav yodeh mamashu, it doesn't mean literally his hand? I'll prove to you that yodeh means literally his hand. And then I'll explain to you your pasuk in a second. Because Batanya Lin Brisa, it says the pasuk in Shemais, if a guy's going to be caught with the stolen item in his hand, says the Brisa, ainly I wouldn't know that you can be chayiv kefil ella only at a time when you took it from yada, his hand. If it was in his courtyard, if it was in his roof, if it was in his enclosed area, that if it went over there and he locked the door to steal it, how do you know that his chutzner acquired from him and he's mechayiv kefil? Tam says in the pasuk, im himatze timatze, which the redundancy teaches mikal makom, however you find it by him. Now says the Gemara like this: because it says himatze timatze, halavach a bit of it didn't. I would have said kolech the chutz of yada, wherever it says his hand, yada mamashu. You see, I would only know literally his hand. I'll bring you another raya. The Tanya learned in the Brisa, says the pasuk Devarim, when you're going to give the get to the woman, it says v'nasa b'yada, you put in her hand. Now, ainly aliyada, I would only know that you could put it into her hand. How do you know you could even put it into her roof, into her courtyard, into her enclosed area? It says v'nasan, which would become makom, like Rashi explains. What do you mean? It doesn't have to say v'nasa b'yada. No, it could have said b'yada yitinenu. In her hand, you would put it. The word v'nasan, without any further word yet, till you get to the next word, it sounds like whatever giving you do. Now it says the Gemara like this: of course the Torah says v'nasan. Allah, but if not that, how do you know what it says? Where it says hand? Yes, only yad imam, only literally hand. So you see, what I'm saying is correct. Yad means miyad misecha means only metal and not karka. Now, so el kol yadai mamishu. So it says the Gemara, fine. So I prove to you that whenever it says yad, it means literally a hand. Shani hasam, what am I going to do with your pasuk? He took his whole land from his hand. Come on, his land's not in his hand. It does rhyme, and maybe Dr. Seuss would like it, but it's not. It doesn't mean that. So, no, that's because over there it's different, because simply it can't mean it. So that's when I'm going to translate it as its possession. When it could mean it, then it will mean it, and therefore will be specifically metala. Now, related discussion. There it says shiur. When you have a rental, yesh lo yana, is there overcharge? Is there a price that you're going to consider as a no, or ein lo no, or there's no halacha b'no? So the Gemara explains the question. On the one hand, do you say mem kam rachman Torah says a sale, avalei schiris but not a rental? No, maybe there's no difference. Somebody Abai says, yeah, miksiv mem kol oilim, does it say in the Torah an eternal sale? Mem kristam exhibit, it just says a sale. A rental is a partial time limited sale, and therefore, the halacha b'no would apply to a rental. Now, Rav has an interesting question that he asks. It says, if you have wheat which was planted into the ground, what's halacha? Yesh l'mayna or ein mayna? If you sell those kernels that are in the ground, would the halacha b'no apply to it or not? So the Gemara explains the question. Do you say on the one hand, command the shad mikad yudamin? It's just like in the jug. It's like just in the ground or in the jug, it's some type of receptacle. It's like regular wheat kernels that'll have halacha b'no. Like Dima, maybe no, but lino gav ara, it's nullified to the ground that you planted in, and we know there's no ino lekarkais, which, as Rashi explains, it didn't take root yet. Obviously, it took root as part of the ground. It didn't take root. So the question is it just like placed in the ground, or is it a part of the ground? So the Gemara says, wait, hey, what's the case talking about? If that guy had said, Shadoi, I had planted ba shita, 6 saw of wheat, I'll sell that to you. And he sold it to him. Then witnesses came along and said, hey, he only planted 5 saw. Is that what the case you told me? You want to know was during na on that sale? That's not true. That can't be. Why not? Isn't this the classical case of a na? No, because Rabbi said, anything that's measured, that's weighed, and that's numbered, which is including what we're discussing over here, even that less than an na, it's going to be halacha of chayzer. You can actually undo it. So Rashi explains the reason for that is because this is what's called as a mekach tois, mistaken acquisition, because he explicitly said that it's like this and it's not like that. Now, since it's a mekach tois, a mistaken acquisition, then even would be nullified through the ground, you would still have to give it back. Because although karkois are excluded from the halacha of na, that's only from a na, but mekach tois is not excluded, because as Rashi explained, this is not a mecher. It's not even a sale, because that was not my understanding when I bought it. So this cannot be a case of a na, because this is a case of mekach tois. So Elirana says the Gemara, no, the case must be talking about Dama Ihu. He said, Shadoiba kidi iboila. He says, I put in the amount of kernels that are necessary for the ground to be planted. Now, what was mistaken was regarding how we generally evaluate is sufficient planting. That's where would be the halacha by na, which is, well, it's not exactly the right amount. And it turns out he didn't plant how much would be necessary. But that wasn't a mekach tois. So that's the question. But wait a second, that's not the normal range. That's like it's overcharging or undercharging. That's the question. Is it going to be a no or not? So the Gemara explains, as we said, the question is, come on, the shod bekadi damin is like just like in the jug. It would have the loch of a no, or maybe we just say that's nullified on the ground, and therefore I know when that apply. That's one question. Another question, which is similarly, is nishboin alein. If let's say someone did a moedim miktzis, the guy claimed, and he says, "Look, you made up with me to plant 6 sa that I gave you, and you only planted 5." And he says, "No, I planted 5.5." So he's like moedim miktzis. Does he make a shvuah or does he not make a shvuah? So the Gemara says same question. Come on, the shad mekad damin is like placed in a jug. You have to swear because regular moedim miktzis. Maybe say it's nullified. It's on the ground and it's like considered karka. You wouldn't swear in it. Another question related to this idea is: will the carbon omer, the barley offering brought on the second day of Pesach, permitted or not permitted? Which, as Rashi explained, the Gemara assumes that we're going on the growths, is what the question is. Because generally that's what it is. The question is, growths were they planted before the carbon omer and they're permitted, or was it after? And if it's not permitted, you have to wait till next Pesach. So that's why the Gemara goes and responds. If it took root before the omer, so the Gemara says, "Wait, hey, what's the guy's talking about? Ida ashrush. If it took root before the omer was brought, Tinina, we learned in the Mishnah Mesechus Menachos that the omer will permit the growth, and the Gemara there explains the reason for that is. And Ida lo ashrush, if it didn't take root when the omer was brought, well, Tinina, we also learned that the omer does not permit it. Not like we learned in the Mishnah Mesechus Menachos. If these wheat took root before the omer permits it, you could eat it that year. If not, as soon as you have you have to wait till the omer of the following year. So who cares? A bottle agar or not? It depends. Did it take root or not? So we needed the chatzdinu. We're not talking about the growth. We're talking about where you harvested this wheat from the new wheat, and you needed that the omer should permit it to be eaten. Now, v'zarinu kaim la'omer, but then you replanted it before the omer was brought. V'aslei omer, then the omer is brought. V'chalav levayu, and now the omer passed by. And it didn't take root before the omer. So the question is to continue out Nun Zayin Min Aleph. In other words, we're not asking on the growths that come out of that wheat kernel, because the truth is, even if the omer permitted the wheat from the previous year before it was planted, and you planted before the omer doesn't take root, so the growth would be forbidden until the omer of the coming year. Our question is specifically regarding to take from those wheat kernels itself in the ground, which were already here before this previous omer, and to eat it now after the omer. What's the question? So the Gemara explains. On the one hand, command the shad mekad damidu, say like it's placed into a jug, and therefore shadino omer. The omer permits whatever is detached that's new from this year, and also growths that are connected that already took root. But this is like something that's detached, and therefore should be permitted. Or maybe no, maybe it's considered nullified into the ground, and we view it like regular ground, and therefore the omer cannot permit this because it's neither detached nor rooted that grew already. So you might take a little sense. It's not clear if the omer will permit it or not. Thank you to any time.